I'm particularly glad to welcome Ambassador Terada to be our guest speaker today. Ambassador Terada, as former Japanese ambassador to Korea, has come to talk about an extremely sensitive, timely matter, and that's Korea's relationship with Japan, but by extension also Korea's relationship with the United States and the rest of the world. Our attention is always focused these days on the headlines of North Korea, and we're so glad that you could come, particularly at this moment, to talk about Korea. For those of you who don't know, Ambassador Terada has very recently retired from a very long and distinguished career in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and has just taken on a new post as president of the Foreign Press Center of Japan. And I think as you deal with journalists from all over the world, you'll keep in mind the values of free speech and that are symbolized by this building. I'd like to, but I can't give you his entire biography in just a few minutes because it's very long and full of public service. But just in the last 15 years or so, Ambassador Terada has held a number of extremely important, sensitive posts. In the late 80s, he was executive assistant to Prime Minister Takeshita for several years, and then went as minister to the Japanese embassy in France. Following that, he was director of the Latin American Caribbean Bureau in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Tokyo, and immediately went from that position to become ambassador to Mexico and concurrently Belize in 1995. Well, not long after he became ambassador to Mexico, he got an unexpected and very dramatic assignment. On December 17, 1996, you'll all recall that the Tupac Amaru rebels took over the Japanese embassy in Lima, and Ambassador Terada was sent as special negotiator to Lima to negotiate the release of the hostages, a process that went on for nearly 5 months and was ultimately successful. Following his assignment in Latin America, he became special ambassador to KEDO, the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, and then in 2000, Ambassador Terada was appointed ambassador to Korea, a post that he held for the last 3 years of his service in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and he's just retired, as I said, from the ministry to become president of the Foreign Press Center in Tokyo. So, in keeping with the spirit of free speech that's symbolized by this sacred place, I've encouraged Ambassador Terada to be as free and open and direct in his comments about Korea, North Korea, and our relations with the two Koreas, and he said he would be delighted to welcome questions after his remarks. So, Ambassador Terada.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I do thank you, Peter Greedy, for your kind remarks. Yes, it's true that when I was ambassador in Mexico, I had a quite a unique experience. I didn't imagine that I would have to deal with guerrillas in Lima. And perhaps after having had this experience in Lima, I was called back. Out of blues, as Mr. Greedy said, I was given the post of ambassadorship to KEDO. When that happened in October 1998, well, there was a certain speculation going on at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Japanese reporters started to say, how come that Mr. Terada was appointed to such a post out of blues? In fact, there are two versions of speculation. One was quite simply that because of his Lima experiences, he would be best equipped to deal with North Koreans. A second explanation, well, I think it's rather laughing matter, I must say. Well, Mr. Terada spent 3 good years in Mexico. Therefore, he should be challenged this time. I'm not quite sure which is true. Anyhow, before I was appointed ambassador to Seoul, I worked about a year and a half dealing with North Korea, but always through KEDO. Even though I was given another appointment, which was ambassador in charge of normalization talks with Pyongyang. But during my tenure, nothing happened. So I did not have any chance to negotiate actually with North Koreans. Having said this, in fact, before coming here, I just wanted to talk about, at length, Japanese-Korean relationship. After all, I spent 3 years, so I thought that I would be duty-bound to talk about bilateral aspect. But when I was here yesterday, our dear Consul General Nishibayashi said to me, listen, now North Korea has become such a political hot potato. You can't end your statements simply talking about bilateral relationship between Japan and South Korea. So therefore, I'm trying to divide my statement in two parts. Firstly, I do like to talk about relationship between Japan and Korea. And after that, yes, I'm going to talk about North Korea, but I'm going to do one thing which you are not very much familiar. In other words, Japan has its negotiation history with North Korea, starting from the year 1991. So in order for you to understand the position of Japan, I thought it would be quite pertinent to talk about a bit this negotiation history. Then afterwards, of course, I do like to take in your questions. Having said this, I have just completed my 3 years tour of duty in January this year. And precisely during my stay in Korea, I have witnessed ups and downs of bilateral relationship. And if you know, of course, modern history of Korea, each presidential mandate endures 5 years. And what happened to us is that starting from the President Noteu, Kim Il-sung, the beginning of the first year was always good and ending quite miserably. This is what we used to see. When I arrived in Seoul, it was the year 2000. Before I went to Seoul, I could see the then Prime Minister Obuchi, as well as our Foreign Minister Kono. They patted me on the shoulder. Mr. Terada, you are a lucky guy. You are going to Korea in a very friendly, positive atmosphere. This is what they said to me. I think their remarks were correct, particularly during the year 2000. After all, still good relationship established by Kim Dae-jun and then Prime Minister Obuchi, still there. And also looking back at the year 2000, in fact, the government of South Korea was already unofficially in touch with Pyongyang, trying to realize the summit. In fact, the summit was realized in June year 2000. So in other words, diplomatically speaking, Seoul didn't have enough time to take care of us. So much attention was focused on the coming summit between Pyongyang and Seoul. Well, also another thing which I should mention on this occasion was that starting from the year 2000, Korean people were allowed to see Japanese films. In other words, until Kim Dae-jun was elected as president of the Korean Republic of Korea, introduction of Japanese culture into Korea was totally banned. So Kim Dae-jun gradually started to permit introduction of Japanese culture, films, music, these kind of things. So therefore, throughout the year 2000, more and more young Koreans were beginning to be exposed to the Japanese culture, particularly pop culture. I'm sure that against this background, I found myself very much comfortable. But anyhow, let me say one thing. After 3 years, I can say that Japan-Korean relationship is deeply ambivalent. This reminds me of the relationship between Mexico and the United States. On 2 different occasions, I spent 7 years in Mexico, and quite often I noted very ambivalent attitude on the part of the Mexican public vis-à-vis the United States, depending on the intensity of both economic and political interactions. This is what I felt in Korea. In other words, Japan-Korean relationship is, on the one hand, really plagued by the past. Korea was very much, unfortunately, colonized by Japan. So in other words, the memories of the past are always lingering in the minds of the Korean people. Therefore, I would say that bilateral relationship is on one hand plagued by memories of the past in the first half of the 20th century. At the same time, because of the independence gained in 1945, the bilateral relationship is framed by important mutuality of economic and security interests. This is what I have concluded after completing my tenure 3 years. Now, I must touch upon the following year, the year 2001. In that year, our relationship became very much tense, precisely because of I'm not quite sure whether you are familiar with the junior high school textbook issues. This textbook issue became really political hot potato between our 2 countries. I don't have any time to explain how the detail of the textbook issue, but anyhow, this particular issue was a really difficult issue to deal with between our 2 governments. In order for you to understand this intensity of the worsening relationship, I can only say that during the year of 2001, I was summoned by the Korean Foreign Minister 8 times, if I remember correctly. And in a foreign country, in the foreign capital, whenever a foreign envoy is to be convoyed by the host country's foreign minister, normally the envoy has received a protest. Always something bad, I would say. I was, in fact, summoned 8 times. I think this is sort of the record among my colleagues in the foreign service. But looking back at this rather sad encounter, whenever I enter the foreign minister's office, I could immediately note the presence of more than 50 or 60 reporters. So that encounter seemed to be sort of the climax scene of the Kabuki theater. In other words, foreign minister was trying to make very strong diplomatic representation to the Japanese envoy and letting Korean press corps taking picture of the scene. The following day, you will see on the front page a Japanese foreign minister summoned by the foreign secretary and apparently given a strong protest. Having had this experience, I did think that doing this sort of theatrical diplomatic game, we would not be able to find a solution to the problem. So finally, we used our last card. We asked our Prime Minister Koizumi to come and talk to Kim Dae-jung directly. Such a blitzkrieg visit was made in October 2001. And when I went to the airport to greet our Prime Minister, Mr. Prime Minister, how often did you come to Korea? I was very much surprised by what he told me. He said, I'm here for the first time. So I took the Prime Minister to see President Kim Dae-jung at Blue House. The conversation lasted 2 hours and a half. It was a very, very difficult moment in my long diplomatic career. The atmosphere was very intense. But I noted that gradually the two heads of the government were beginning to understand each other. So thanks to this summit in 2001, at least we could find a way out of this crisis. So I learned one lesson, particularly between Japan and Korea. Prime Minister and President should get acquainted from the start. In fact, when I was in Seoul, year 2000, at that time, Prime Minister Oguchi was there, but unfortunately enough, as you know, he passed away. And he was replaced by Prime Minister Mori, who served only 1 year, then replaced by Koizumi. So having learned this lesson, when new president was born in Korea, Roh Moo-hyun, I went to see him and I asked him 3 things. Firstly, please pay good attention between Japan and Korea. Secondly, in order for us to cope with the North Korean situation, we do need a very close coordination between 3 countries, Japan, Korea, and the United States. And thirdly, I personally asked him to receive Prime Minister Koizumi on the day of President's inauguration, which was on the 25th February this year. It was after my departure from Seoul, but it was done. Well, during the year 2001, as I said, it was very, very difficult year because of textbook issues, and there are also other issues as well. But still, I noted one bright spot. That was quite interesting enough, economic relationship. Business communities of Japan and Korea kept saying that there should not be any spillover of tax issues over the economic as well as business relationship between Japan and Korea. That was quite revealing. But also, my experience in Mexico reminded me of such importance in the areas of economic interaction. Before the entry into force of NAFTA, I used to witness emotional reaction which arose from time to time in Mexico vis-à-vis the United States. But after NAFTA became effective between the two, between the United States, Canada on one hand, and Mexico on the other, political relation has evolved very much indeed. Yes, quite often still Mexican government grumbles vis-à-vis Washington. but not as much as it used to do before the entry into force of NAFTA. So I had this conclusion that if we are able to build mutually benefiting economic relations, such relations would be serving as shock absorber against eventual fluctuation of political and diplomatic relationship. This is the very reason why the governments of Japan and Korea have started to work very seriously at the possible conclusion of free trade agreement between our two countries. We are still jointly studying ways and means of conducting such negotiation. But I think it will be a question of time, perhaps 2 or 3 years. And if we could have FTA, which guarantees quite naturally free movement of peoples, goods and services, and capital, such an economic agreement, I'm sure, would alleviate any possible diplomatic as well as political friction which might arise from time to time. Now, before I explain our concern to North Korea, let me add a couple of things to my observation regarding Japan and South Korea. You may certainly remember World Cup 2002, co-hosted by Japan and Korea. In fact, this World Cup was held first ever in Asia. And I was witnessing this successful holding of World Cup 2002. I was very much impressed, in fact, by the fact that World Cup offered invaluable opportunities for the young peoples of Japan and Korea. And I did note that they started to get mutually interested. They tried to get to know each other. So, in fact, very active, positive interaction was at play among the young peoples of Japan and Korea. I was indeed very much impressed. And from that on, I have concluded that the exchange of young peoples between the two countries would be a positive determinant for the future of a bilateral relationship. Another thing which I should like to mention is that perhaps you have heard quite often President Kim Dae-jun's sunshine policy towards North Korea. But my experience dealing with President Kim Dae-jun was that he used to have 2 sets of sunshine policy. One vis-à-vis Pyongyang, another dealing with Japan. My personal assessment is that Kim Dae-jun's sunshine policy towards Pyongyang was a failure as a short or mid-term policy. But his sunshine policy toward Japan, well, showed positive and tangible result in spite of the turmoil that we experienced during the year 2001. So the question is, what's going to happen with the new president, Roh Moo-hyun? Oh, he's coming to Washington, by the way, and he'll be seeing President Bush on the 14th May. I was, in fact, one of the rare Japanese who could see President Roh Moo-hyun 6 times. 4 times before he was elected president, twice after he was elected president. And when he was a presidential candidate, I could invite him to have a dinner with me. And also, October last year, he was kind enough to have a lunch with me. Through my association with this presidential candidate, before the election, I really thought that he was a very flexible man, but I was not quite sure of his policy, for instance, toward North Korea, for instance. And once, of course, he was elected president, when I saw him, I just wanted to congratulate him on his success. I found a rather different person. In fact, he was well briefed, and in front of him, I saw a sheet of paper, which is apparently briefing paper already prepared by his, top-level aides. So his dealing with me was slightly different from what I had experienced. But one thing which pleasantly surprised was that he assured me really in front of me that he would do his best to continue to have a good relationship with Japan. So I think with this new president, I'm sure that we'll be having a good relationship. Now, question mark is how he's going to deal with North Korea. Well, I arrived at New York Wednesday last week, and on Friday I was attending a seminar organized by Japan Society. We debated mostly the question of Japan-Korea relationship as well as North Korea. Before we did that, at Beijing talks, Pyongyang declared that, yes, there are nukes. This revelation changed entirely, naturally, the positions of the government of Japan and Korea. We suspected that Pyongyang might have nuclear weapons, but we did not expect such a declaration. So the question is how best we shall be able to deal with this crisis situation. Very briefly, I must tell you that from 91 to 92, we had 8 rounds of negotiations. After the end of the Cold War in 1990, Soviet Union established diplomatic relationship with Republic of Korea. Under that international environment, I think it was quite normal for Pyongyang to seek to establish relationship with Japan, trying to get economic cooperation from us. Therefore, we started to negotiate. What happened was quite typical of Pyongyang's negotiating behavior. On the occasion of the 8th round of negotiation, which took place in November 92, the Japanese side raised 2 issues, basically. The question of abduction. Secondly, nuclear issues. Then negotiations broke down. After that, 7.5 years passed. And when Waco resumed the negotiation, It was the year 2000. The year 2000 was very much significant. There was a North-South Summit, and Pyongyang started to establish diplomatic relationship with a large number of Western European countries. So there was no wonder why Pyongyang was again interested in resuming negotiations. We had 3 rounds of negotiations. Again, we stopped. And we understood the negotiating position of Pyongyang, I think characterized by 2 points. Firstly, Pyongyang wishes that Japan apologizes profusely over the past act during the colonization period. Secondly, Pyongyang wishes to have a huge economic compensation. Against these negotiation positions, we approach this normalization issue from more comprehensive positions. Yes, we have to normalize relationship. Normalization of relationship with North Korea is a bilateral aspect. But this process should have another international dimension involving humanitarian aspects as well as security aspects. Security aspects are, in fact, represented by nuclear matters as well as missile issues. Well, having exposed our comprehensive approach, then negotiations again stopped. But quite interesting enough, after the end of the last normalization talks in the year 2000, afterwards we started our unofficial contacts. And an unofficial contact started sometime in the year 2001. But quite interesting enough, these unofficial contacts produced one tangible result. That was Japan-North Korea summit, which was realized on the 17th of September last year. And I saw our Prime Minister, Koizumi, shaking hands with Kim Jong-il in September last year. Then both leaders published a Pyongyang Declaration. The question is, why Pyongyang agreed with us to have such a summit? In my mind, as a North Korea observer, I may conclude that economic condition got so much deteriorated. Pyongyang felt obligated to have external, particularly economic assistance. And Japan was considered as an ideal candidate. After all, Japan concluded normalization agreement with the Republic of Korea in 1965. Japan offered as much as $500 million at that time. But through our unofficial contacts, we kept saying that in order to realize such a summit, we must find a solution to the pending question, which is in fact that of abduction. So when the summit took place, Yes, as you know perhaps, Kim Jong-il confessed, as a matter of fact, that one of his organization had abducted Japanese. And I think, quite interesting enough, as I was in Seoul at the time of the Japanese-North Korean summit, I was watching one thing. This Pyongyang declaration signed by the two leaders does not make any reference to the question of abduction. But it says, quite interesting enough, Japanese government apologized to North Korea over the colonial rule. And the statement says further that after normalization reached between Japan and North Korea, Japan will start to talk about economic cooperation between Tokyo and Pyongyang. So from my point of view, I would say that this Japan-North Korea declaration can be used as a very useful diplomatic stick. If you like to have economic cooperation, you have to negotiate to normalize a relationship. In order for us to normalize, we have to resolve completely not only abduction issues, but also security matters, nuclear, as well as missile issues, for instance. Now, facing the present crisis, what I'm personally hoping for is that now again, we should have to establish sort of a roadmap which we have to work on together with United States and Korean governments. And in this roadmap, we have to show how we can remove nuclear threat as well as missile issues. So I think time has come that three capitals, Tokyo, Washington, and Pyongyang, Seoul, will have to look at this crisis situation very seriously. And the occasion of Nomi's visit to Washington provides us with initial opportunity to do so. I think I should stop here, otherwise this is going to be an endless statement of what I'm observing. Now I do like to take your questions, and I'd like to answer your questions. Since I'm here at this historical place, and I must say anything with freedom, and since I have left the government, I do not have to tool the official line. So please. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for your comments. What do you think is or are the catalysts for North Korea's increased sensitivity toward South Korea, Japan, the United States? And what is the role of the Chinese government, if any, in resolving that? You mentioned Korea, Japan, and the United States. Is there a role for China?
Yes.
Excuse me. Could you repeat the question, or I'll repeat the question? For the sake of the people recording, we need to have the question repeated.
Yes. Please go ahead.
The question was, I've been asked to repeat the questions, but the question was simply, what is the catalyst for the next steps, I guess, in future discussions? And the second part of your question, on the role of China and Beijing in the ongoing negotiations.
What is or what were the catalysts to get North Korea to the present level of sensitivity, and what, if any, is the role of China in resolving it?
the role of China. What is the role of China in future discussions?
Well, thank you very much indeed. In fact, one factor which I failed to mention, in fact, Chinese role in this very important exercise. But as a matter of fact, yes, I think we have to embrace China. But in the first place, yes, judging from my own experiences, that we have to consolidate tripartite consultation, tripartite cooperation. And with that tripartite cooperation consolidated, then we are in a position to embrace China. But what has happened already was, in fact, that trilateral meeting which took place in Beijing. And from my limited experiences dealing with the question of Korea, China used to be very much reluctant to get involved. And quite often I have the chance to talk to the Chinese ambassador station in Seoul, listen, why does the government of China not get more proactive in persuading the Pyongyang regime? But I think starting from last year, the situation had changed remarkably when Mr. Kerry went to Pyongyang and Kim Jong-il, through his subordinates, made another confession. In other words, Pyongyang already has or acknowledged the existence of enriched plutonium-based nuclear program. Therefore, the cadre for which I used to work took a decision to cut off the heavy fuel oil supply to DPRK. Then, as we witnessed during the crisis years of '94, well, Pyongyang started to increase threat momentum. And I'm really quite sure that this increased threat was giving a certain degree of impact on the policymaker of the Chinese government. In fact, nuclear crisis was becoming very much serious. And we do know that China doesn't wish to see any presence of nuclear weapons by DPRK. And also, I noted a shift of attitude on the part of the Chinese government when I noted the fact that the Chinese government cut off oil supply for 3 days. That was in fact a signal made to Pyongyang policymakers. So I think under the Chinese, persuasive pressure, Pyongyang agreed to hold not one-on meeting, but trilateral meeting. So under the present circumstances, yes, definitely I'm recognizing more and more importance of the role which China can play. But what I'd like to say is that, of course, accepting the Chinese role, free capital will have to coordinate much more closely, because after all, in Seoul, now we have a new president. Myself, I'm not really quite sure of his actual policy towards North Korea, but his visit to Washington, and eventually after that, I understand that he will be coming to Japan in June. His visit will provide us with an invaluable opportunity of doing this vital diplomatic exercise. Thank you. Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, it's an honor. And,
Thank you.
I just had a chance to go to Korea about a month ago.
Oh, yes, you did.
And I realized that a lot of people's perceptions of Japanese culture and basic, just everyday people have changed slightly since about 2 years ago when the president, emperor, had made comments about old imperial line and connections to old Korean kingdoms.
Right.
I had a chance to speak to many grandparents, and they actually had expressed that them before they died, that was a defining moment in their life that, you know, the Japanese officially had mentioned something about the history, and that was changing a lot of perceptions in Korea.
Yes.
You know, and I just wanted to see what you thought about that.
Question, in a nutshell, this young man just came back from a recent trip to Korea and said that he sensed a great shift and change in perceptions of the Korean people toward Japan, largely as a result, partially as a result of the emperor's statements about recent history, if not a full apology, at least acknowledgments of the historical relationship, and was asking Ambassador Terada how he would evaluate that situation.
But I think, well, of course, my experience with Korea has been 3 years. I was in fact, well, noting a generational difference. This is what I mean to say, that among the young people ranging from 20 and 30s, they're quite open. And in fact, they are very much exposed to the cultural inter-exchanges. That's quite good indeed, because nowadays young people do like certain Japanese pop singers, likewise Japanese people. And I made a quite silly mistake when I was giving an interview to a French newspaper man. He was asking about boa, B-O-A. Do you know boa? Of course I know. Boa is a huge snake which you can find in the Amazon. But he was referring to a very lovely young Korean singer getting to be quite popular in Japan, you know. So this kind of thing is taking place very, very routinely. That is quite good. But still, I was confronted with people over 50s, and apparently my impression was that he had a very strong anti-Japan education when they were young. So almost impossible for me to have them change or to ask them to look at the Japanese-Korea relationship more positively. So my conclusion is that we still have to wait for the generational change in order to see much brighter future between two countries. But one thing which I can say that now Korea has per capita income of more than $10,000, member of OECD. So I know that Korean people are in a better position to express themselves. But in that case, of course, younger people are just expressing their feelings very positively to Japan and vice versa in Japan. But alas, I'm not able to find any answer how we could go along well with people between 50 and 65 years old. World Cup, yes, has been a positive vehicle in bringing both peoples of our two countries closer. And this is for that, reason we decided to start a new young people's exchange program between Japan and Korea starting from this year. So there's, in fact, dynamic force, particularly involving, motivating young people. But at the same time, I must say that, yes, our relationship has the past. We always have to keep looking at it. But as new President Roh Moo-hyun said to me, yes, we must recognize the fact, historical fact. But we should not be bound by it all the time. So we must go ahead. We must make a positive move. This was what I was told by a new president. So at least I'm getting to be rather optimistic.
If I could just ask a question,
Yes.
Mr. Ambassador, I wonder if you could comment on your sense, cutting through all the rhetoric, of the sort of fundamental priorities, objectives, in a priority sense, of the North Koreans. Are they mostly looking for economic survival, economic support? Are they looking primarily to be considered a nuclear superpower? How would you prioritize their fundamental objectives?
Yes, so that is a very good, sensitive question. Because I do not have any precise information as to what has transpired at Beijing meeting. I don't know. I'm now in the private sector. I don't have any access to the government these days. But still, if what newspapers say holds good, my impression is that still Pyongyang is trying to use nukes to have huge economic rewards, seems to me. If such were the case, Pyongyang would be, adhering to the same negotiating tactics. Well, this should be explained by the fact that North Korean economy seems to me has collapsed. And for instance, looking at what was done on the 1st July last year, a new price mechanism was introduced into the North Korean economy. The price of rice was increased tremendously, sometimes 70 or 80 times more. And of course, salary was increased 20 times. But Kim Jong-il just wanted to have more strong economy. But looking at the North Korean economy, without having external economic factor in the form of investment, we do not see any chance at all. Now, I think North Korean economy is in the state of sort of hyperinflation. From that point of view, and also you should not forget the fact that Kim Jong-il is dependent on the military forces. Without strong economy, you can't support such a strong military establishment. So I think it's imperative for Pyongyang policy makers to obtain as much economic assistance as possible. So in that context, I still feel that Pyongyang is using fast-free nuclear weapons as a sort of leverage to get economic assistance.
Other questions? Carl?
Has there been any concern with the credibility that, in fact, North Koreans have nuclear weapons? Because there's no sign that any test of such a weapon has occurred. And it seems like had a test occurred, we would know it. The Chinese would know it. Most everyone.
Absent specific indication of nuclear tests, is there any, what would you say about the credibility of the nuclear claim by North Korea?
Yes, I think you are absolutely right. But the fact remains that in 1989, that 5 megawatt nuclear reactor stopped its operation for some time. And checking the report made at that time by DPRK to IAEA, there's, yes, indeed, huge discrepancy. So we quite naturally conclude that there may be certain amount of plutonium with which, theoretically speaking, you may be able to produce 1 or 2 nukes. That's all. And I think you are quite right that I'm not a nuclear scientist, but without conducting any tests, how could you manufacture? And also another thing is that in order to have such a nuclear bomb, well, as a nuclear bomb which can be delivered, you have to miniaturize it. I never think that Pyongyang may be able to do that. Well, in that case, perhaps Pyongyang is just using that as sort of a bluff, just trying to make us believe that there are 1 or 2 nukes, trying to use them as diplomatic weapons. But I'm not quite sure.
Any other questions? Well, if not, thank you very much. You're as frank as we asked you to be, and I'm very appreciative.
Well, thank you so much
Thank
indeed.
you.
And also, I do thank you for inviting me at this